I'm the Associate Vice President of Student Affairs and Dean of Students at this lovely campus. And we are so excited to be hosting our ATOD conference this year. It is my great honor to introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is Stapleton. She's a co-director of Prevention and Data Innovations, the lead developer and evaluator of Know Your Power. I've had an opportunity to speak with her a little before our session today, and know that she is a huge ally for all of us in higher education. And we appreciate her leaving the University of New Hampshire and the cold for sunny California. Ladies and gentlemen, I welcome and am proud to announce our first speaker. Thank you.
I need to say that it was not hard to get me on a plane in Boston and London to probably the most beautiful place in the world right now. I'm 5 feet tall and we had more snow in New Hampshire than me. So I'm sorry I was able to bring some of that precipitation here from California. It's wonderful to be here. I've been working with the CSU staff and the organizers for the past couple months, and so I was really pleased to be asked to come here. And when I was first asked to come, the message came through, can you come and speak at the ATOD conference? And my initial response, I had 2 responses. One was, I would love to go to California. And the second one was, they know I don't do ATOD stuff, right? And so then I reflected and I thought, well, actually the work that I do with bystander intervention is actually really related to ATOD prevention. So what I'm going to do is talk with you about the work that I do with bystander intervention. And I'm going to use the context of sexual and relationship violence and stalking. But I'm also going to make connections with ATOD. And I'm going to ask you, particularly because it's obviously your area of expertise in doing ATOD prevention, what connections you see with the work that I'm doing with sexual and relationship violence and stalking prevention, because I think that there's a pretty strong link, and so I'm going to really encourage you to help contextualize that good. So I'll start, and I'm more than happy to answer questions throughout the session. I know we've got an hour, and I'm going to ask you to kind of shout out some stuff as we go along, but feel free to stop me at any point if you have questions or you want to know more about what I'm talking about. So I'll give you just the context of sexual and relationship violence and stalking, just sort of from a national level, and I'll talk a little bit about New England in particular. But the reason why I do the work that I do in preventing sexual and relationship violence and stalking is because of the statistics. And I know the Channel Islands president just talked and gave a lot of statistics about ATOD use, and clearly that's what motivates you to do your work. But in our field, we know that actually sexual assault of women is actually the most dangerous and violent crime that they will experience on campuses today. So I'm going to talk with you about the context of sexual and relationship violence and stalking. I'm going to talk with you about bystander intervention, prevention, and I'm going to tell you sort of some of the lessons learned in the work that I do. So 28% of first-year women have experienced unwanted sexual contact, and 7% of these first-year women during their first year, again, oftentimes within the first couple of weeks, have experienced unwanted sexual assault. So the numbers are pretty huge, and I'm sure that that sort of resonates particularly with the students in the room, am I right? I mean, that's the reality that we live with. A more sort of national figure says that 1 in 5 women, college women, will experience sexual assault. Now, you tell me, do we only think about women as being the victims of sexual assault?
No.
Okay, so what do we know about men? We know that nationally, 3 to 4% of American men experience an attempted or completed sexual assault during adulthood. And a recent study, again, that we did on my campus shows that 7% of college men report an attempted or completed sexual assault while in college. So we need to sort of think about a comprehensive understanding of the problems. of sexual and relationship violence and stalking. So again, here's the ATOD connection. We don't have great statistics on this, but I want you to tell me what these statistics mean. Okay, so when we look at the incidence of alcohol and/or drugs and sexual assault, we don't have great data. But what we know is that oftentimes we see perpetrators as well as victims under the influence of alcohol and/or drugs. So I want to just kind of put it back to you folks, because you're in this world, the ATOD world. What are you seeing as far as ATOD use in sexual assault? How do you think the two are connected? Okay, so risk factors are increased. What's the other connection? Yeah.
I think when alcohol is involved, they commit a sexual assault. Like, I know I was drunk, I know I shouldn't have been there, I know I was in that position. So there's a lot of minimizing what happened because they.
Yeah. Good. Other things that come to mind when you make connections? Yeah, the guy in the shirt and then way back.
When alcohol is involved, it gives people an excuse to say that they weren't raped. It was, or sexually assaulted. It was them being stupid. It gives them an excuse out of it.
Yeah.
When you're under the influence, you're unable to give consent, and that's probably one of the keys to sexual assault, I'm guessing, with alcohol.
Yeah. Excellent point. Any other points? All right, so there's lots of points to be made, and we'll continue to make them through my presentation. But it is really important to know that risk factors are increased, but oftentimes what we hear, particularly from victims, is, well, it's my fault because I had too much to drink or I was under the influence of drugs. And sometimes victims sort of take that on themselves, right? They self-blame. And sometimes, a lot of times, they hear that from their peers or their friends. And sometimes they look or they hear about cases being adjudicated, sometimes in the criminal justice system where the victim was under the influence of alcohol. And the message clearly gets presented from the defense that somehow she, oftentimes, right, she is responsible for the sexual assault. We oftentimes don't hear perpetrators or alleged perpetrators saying, well, if I didn't drink, I never would have done that. So we know that there are clear connections, and I'm going to, again, demonstrate some of those connections throughout my presentation. So I want to, again, just in building the context for the work that I do on bystander intervention, and again, some of you might be familiar with this, particularly if you're working in student affairs or you have administrative positions. The time is sort of a very intense one for sexual and relationship violence and stalking, particularly on college campuses. The recent Dear Colleague letter about Title IX, the Campus Save Act is requiring colleges and universities to do prevention programs with students. The Clery Act is, as always, requires universities to report violent crime statistics. Recently, the White House actually, President Obama put together a task force to protect students from sexual assault. And all of that really comes, I think, as the President's putting the task force together on all this information that we have about the incidence of sexual and relationship violence and stalking. And for the President, honestly, I think there's a personal reason. What might President Obama's personal reason for putting emphasis on this big? He has 2 daughters. So I don't know if any of you are parents or have nieces or people who are close to you, but I have a 10-year-old daughter. And it scares me so much to think about her being in college, particularly because of this issue. And I sometimes say that the reason why I do my work is so the reality that she faces will not be sort of one of those statistics, but also so that she will be a proactive bystander to create a community that doesn't accept violence. So there's been a lot of emphasis on this topic in recent months, really. Okay, so actually I'm going to go back to this for a second, and I'm going to ask you again to shout out. I want to start to talk about bystander
people standing around when they see a fight break out,
Okay, so what are they doing? They're watching?
watching or cheering it on.
Okay. What else comes to mind when you think of bystanders?
People just kind of looking the other direction.
Minding their own business. Okay, so passive. Any other thoughts? Yeah.
With the increase in technology and how advanced we are with social media and stuff like that, a lot of bystanders now have the tendency to whip out their phones or whip out whatever and shoot whatever's going on instead of actually doing something.
Yeah, and I think that's such an important point. Are you familiar with Hollaback? Hollaback. It actually is an organization, and some people over here are smiling. It actually is an organized grassroots movement, actually, that is encouraging people to use their cell phones to actually take pictures or video of street harassment. So yeah. Okay, other thoughts about bystanders? How about some positive views of bystanders? Do we have any views? Positive views? Yeah.
Just getting involved and saying something.
Okay, yeah, so sort of saying something maybe to try to stop the problem or to remedy the situation. Was there somebody else who had a hand up?
I was just saying that they can be there to diffuse the situation or call on other parents to be able to help assist.
Yeah, so diffusing or calling somebody to assist. Yeah, so what's really interesting about bystander intervention? So basically bystanders are witnesses to emergencies or criminal events or potential criminal events where their intervention could potentially make a difference. So they're really sort of faced with a couple of options. One is they could do nothing, like the couple of folks said, that they sort of passively watch, or maybe they turn their head away. Or maybe they sort of positively intervene, try to diffuse the situation or call for help, or they might, unfortunately, sometimes bystanders contribute to the problem. And it's sort of interesting because I think one of the adjectives that oftentimes is associated with bystanders is innocent bystander. Okay, are you familiar with that? So it's sort of like, well, they really had nothing to do with the situation, and you kind of get this sort of passive thought of bystanders. So bystander intervention really is taking on a new form now, and it really is more of a positive pro-social bystander movement. And so it really sort of calls upon bystanders to act in a way that helps to either remedy the situation, to call for assistance, and to have a positive impact on the situation. And we call it being a pro-social bystander. So they're individuals who sort of, their behavior to intervene in ways that impacts the situation positively. And so that's what I'm going to show you today and tell you about the lessons that we've learned in doing pro-social bystander work. Just a really quick background. So bystander intervention, really research, started in the 1960s with Kitty Genovese. So for those of you that maybe the psychology 401 or 101 class, you may have learned about Kitty Genovese. She was brutally murdered and attacked in Queens, New York in 1964, and really in the alley behind where she lived. And it's estimated that up to 38 people were in their apartments or in close proximity, and no one called the police or physically tried to intervene. Now there were at least two people, one of whom turned on the lights in their apartment, and another who made some noise that actually made the perpetrator leave the scene of the crime, but he came back 3 times. He left Kitty Genovese murdered in a dumpster. And it's really a really tragic story, and actually sort of makes me sad to think about certainly that happening, particularly when people couldn't intervene. And so it started researchers really asking the question, sorry, where to start? Jumping in there. So nobody intervened. So researchers started to ask the question, how could everyday well-meaning citizens do nothing to intervene? So why do you think no one intervened potentially, I mean, they witnessed a very violent person, and so they were afraid to certainly put themselves in harm's way. Right? Why else might they not have intervened?
Assume somebody else would.
They assume somebody else would, right? Especially in an urban setting, you think, well, there's 100 people who live in this apartment building, somebody else will. Any other thoughts on why?
Assuming that it would stop on its own.
I'm sorry, say that.
Assuming that it would stop on its own.
Yeah, so just sort of like, this guy will eventually stop. So those are all great ideas. Okay, so here's what the research confirms, and I wanted to tell you about the research because it really has informed the work that I do around bystander intervention. And so what the early researchers did after Kitty Genovese was murdered is that they asked this question on what are the situational factors that impact whether or not someone will intervene. And so one of the really important ones, is this one an automatic? Does the tech guy? Yeah. Can we stop that, please? Okay, so here's where I want to be. So one of the really important aspects of bystander intervention is you need to be able to recognize the situation. So you need to be able to say something bad is happening or the potential for something bad to happen is in front of me and my assistance is needed. So recognizing the situation is really important. The other thing, and this is, I think, consistent with what we've known for a long time, but if someone is asked to intervene, they are more likely to intervene, right? And so being asked plays a big factor in whether or not you'll intervene. The other really important piece is having a role model. And I sort of think about Kitty Genovese, and perhaps the people didn't know what to do, right? They had never seen, maybe I can imagine it would be really traumatic to see that, so they didn't really know what to do. So the researchers have said that, or identified that having a role model really makes a difference. And so if you have previously seen somebody be a bystander, you're more likely to be a bystander if you're able to say, I know what to do in this situation. The other really important piece is having a personal sense of responsibility, and what that means is that bystanders have empathy with the victim in the situation. They understand that somehow what's happening to this person impacts me. The other thing, and somebody mentioned this, is that group size really impacts whether or not somebody will intervene. And so it's called diffusion of responsibility, or the bystander effect, if you will. And it basically says the bigger the group, the larger the group, the less likely one individual is to step forward because they think somebody else will do it. So where bystander intervention is at now is we have moved away from a little bit the situations that really encourage people to be bystanders, and we're looking more at the social norms and looking at how bystanders can change social norms. And so what that means is that we want to get bystanders to change community norms. Okay, so in sexual and relationship violence and stalking, we want bystanders to create a community where those problems are not at all accepted. And I'm going to sort of demonstrate that, you see. So I want to tell you a little bit about the research of David Lisak. How many of you have heard of David Lisak? Okay, so I'm excited to share his research with you, and I would really encourage you. He actually has done it's a pretty provocative training video for judges on his research. It's 6 minutes long. You can, I think, find it on YouTube. You should really watch it. But David Lisak is a researcher, and he did his research, a national study of college men. Over 3,000 men responded to a paper survey, and he asked them a number of questions about their behaviors. And one of the series of questions that he asked them had to do with, had they ever, and this is how the question was worded, had they ever forced a woman to have sex when she didn't want to, which is the legal definition of rape in almost every state. So he didn't say, have you ever raped a woman, because obviously most men would say that they have. So he found that of these 3,000 men that he surveyed, 6% of them had actually committed what would be considered sexual assault. And so that finding is really significant for a couple of reasons. One is because it really dispels the myth that all men are rapists, right? So it's really a small number of men who are committing these crimes, and actually, not only are they committing these crimes, they're committing multiple crimes. And he calls them actually serial perpetrators. 70% of these men actually had committed up to 4 sexual assaults, and they also committed intimate partner violence, child abuse, and theft. So they are serial perpetrators. And so what David Lisak did then was he interviewed the men in this pool, and what he found is that they essentially are undetected rapists, and that's what the study is called. But what he also found was that these men are surrounded by what are called facilitators. Okay, so they're in the middle, these core sex offenders, and they're surrounded by facilitators. And so these are men and women who essentially help them facilitate their sexual assault crimes. And so I'm going to ask you to maybe just do a quick brainstorm. How do you think facilitators can support and help these core sex offenders commit their crimes? Yeah.
I think one way is if they're the ones throwing the party, they give them a designated area where they know to go to and to show them where they keep everything at to change, to get rid of evidence, and that's the reason why facilitators are a big part of it.
Yes, exactly. That's a great example. They're the ones who say, you can use my room, or I'll clean up the room after you leave. So yeah, that's a great example. How else? Yeah. Yep.
Would it be a bartender who knew a person had too much drink but continued to offer female drinks even when he realized?
Yes. Great example. Bartender can absolutely be a facilitator. The bartender, he or she continues to pour the drinks of the person who they know should not be drinking anymore because the person they're with is encouraging them or giving them an extra tip to do so. Yeah, good example. Other ways that facilitators? Yeah.
You have the word up there, rape culture. Even that itself is a huge facilitator. So, for example, media and how they portray women, men, or the LGBT community, that can also be a facilitator itself. Because of, you have that up there too, hypermasculinity.
Yeah.
So just perpetuating these stereotypes of how men should act and women should act.
Yeah, and so thanks for actually calling that stuff out. Yeah, so the core sex offenders are surrounded by rape culture, so callous sexual attitudes, hypermasculinity, denigration of women, sexism, racism, and we could sort of feel this. And the rape culture essentially camouflages the core sex offender's behavior so that it's seen as normal. And that's really dangerous, right? Because if it's seen as normal, then the problem isn't with the core sex offender, the problem is with who? Society, it's sort of like this amorphous society, nobody's to blame, and really, when you come down to blaming anybody, it's oftentimes the victim, right? So yeah, good examples of facilitators. Another really good example, and then I'm going to actually show you some in our social marketing campaign. It's the day after the sexual assault, and the perpetrator is sort of bragging about what they did last night. And the folks who are sitting around the table are either laughing, high-fiving, giving them positive reinforcement. So the facilitators immediately surround core sex offenders, and then there are bystanders. And actually, the facilitators have the potential to be bystanders, but they don't. They actually help with the crime. So then the bystanders sort of surround the facilitators, and they have the potential to intervene. And so that's really what we're trying to do, is because David Lisak says, and again, he's a forensic psychologist, we are never, ever, ever going to reach the core sex offenders by having them go through a prevention program, right? We're not going to stop them. How we're going to stop them is if we can get to the facilitators and the bystanders to essentially create a community community norms that says this isn't acceptable in our community. Okay. So I want you to, for a moment, just think about your own community. And I know that most of you are from colleges and universities, so think of your campus. And I want you to think about who are the bystanders in your community? Okay, so the people who are sort of on that outer level, who sort of are watching what's happening. So just tell me who they are and shout them out.
Like party goers, you see something going on, but you're not stepping in.
Yeah, so the people who are at the party just by chance, actually. Who else are bystanders? Yeah, well, actually everyone is. So let's just name, I think it's important to name who those people are, because if we don't, then oftentimes what happens, and this is, I'm sort of speaking oftentimes from a college administrator point of view, is we say, well, the only bystanders are the students, right? Right? How many faculty in here? Okay, so if you're a faculty member, how many times have you either read a student's paper where they've disclosed that they've been assaulted, or that they've witnessed an assault, their friend's been assaulted, their mother's been assaulted, right? So faculty see it in the papers that students are writing. Health services staff, right? So let's just name some of the bystanders for the sake of really kind of calling out everybody who's a bystander.
Businesses.
Businesses. So just say how businesses are.
Sometimes they don't want to leave their residents to get involved in a violent act, to remove themselves from the picture one step.
Yeah, that's such a great example, and I'm going to show you sort of where they fall from the prevention scope. So yes, businesses are important. Who else? Yeah?
Coaches.
Coaches. Absolutely. Or advisors of fraternities or sororities or clubs. Yeah.
Friends.
Friends. Exactly. Whether or not they're on-campus friends or whether or not they're friends from back home. Who else would we put into the mix of being a bystander? RAs. Yeah, sure. And they literally are trained as first responders. Yeah. Anybody else we've left out?
Family members.
Family members, thank you. Family members, absolutely. Friends, oh, you said friends. Alumni, right? Really important. They come, but I don't know. I know at our institution, alumni weekend is, it's basically they descend upon our campus, right? So they're probably alumni. Administrators, right? The folks who are setting policies, etc. Okay, so I want to talk about prevention really quickly. And then I'm going to put bystander intervention and prevention together, and I'm going to show you what it looks like. I'm sure from the ATOD field you're familiar with the different levels of prevention, but I just wanted to call them out. So primary prevention really is kind of stopping the problem before it happens, and ultimately, don't we all want that, right? Even in ATOD prevention, right? We want to stop the problem before it happens. And so, thus, it would reduce the incidence of the problem. The secondary prevention is actually really stopping the problem as it's occurring, right? So it's already in existence. And then tertiary prevention is really sort of providing an intervention for those who have been impacted by the problem. Now, we actually, for sexual and relationship violence and stalking, we actually still know very little about the impact of our prevention on decreasing victimization and perpetration, which is really, that's challenging because we want to know whether or not we're being effective. And one of the things that oftentimes happens with sexual and relationship violence and stalking is when you start doing prevention work on it, and you let people know that they can come and talk to you, and the university takes this seriously, guess what? They start reporting more. So I'm going to ask, I know there's a few college administrators in the room, what happens when people start reporting it more? And it's in the news more, and they start talking to their families more. Does it look good for your institution? Yeah, ultimately it is good, because essentially what that means is that your institution takes this issue seriously, but initially it seems like, wow, they've really got a problem, right, in Santa Barbara or wherever. So it's one of the challenges. And historically, the prevention of sexual and relationship violence and stalking has focused on risk reduction. And I know that that's probably a term that you're really familiar with, the ATOD field, right? Kind of reducing the risk. And while that's really important for really all kinds of prevention, in the sexual and relationship violence and stalking field, if we only focus on risk reduction, it assumes that perpetrators are always going to perpetrate. And what we want to do is just get victims out of harm's way, or potential victims. And so we're really sort of changing the focus to say, no, perpetrators will not always perpetrate. Right? We can sort of rid our community of perpetration. The most effective programs that we've been able to measure, we know that they increase knowledge of the problems and they decrease rapeness, which all, again, impact the incidence of sexual assault. What we know about prevention is that the sort of the one-shot deal, the one program, is never going to solve the problem. Right? So we need to develop comprehensive prevention strategies. Really, really important. We also need to have well-trained facilitators, and ultimately, just as you were sort of calling out the different bystanders, everybody needs to be engaged in the prevention of sexual and relationship violence and stalking. Everybody is a bystander. Okay, so I want to show you what bystander intervention looks like. And I'm going to show you, can you all see that? So this is actually, these are some images from our Know Your Power bystander intervention social marketing campaign. And I tried to pull all the alcohol, or a lot of the alcohol-related ones together here. I really had the opportunity to develop and evaluate this campaign. And it has been informed by the target audience, which is our majority is undergraduate college students across the country. So we've developed images at the University of New Hampshire, and all the way, we've come all the way to UC Merced. And I'll show you the Merced images, a couple of the Merced images. So what we do is we develop these images with input from our target audiences. That's really important. And we always have sort of a knowledge piece here. So we want to let people know that alcohol is the #1 date rape drug. Don't let anyone use alcohol to commit sexual assault. So this really is almost the same scenario that the gentleman in the back, when I asked what does bystander intervention look like, he said it's sort of like, the party, planning the party, and somebody says, yeah, I'll help you. So here's an instance where the bystanders, potential facilitators, actually step in to be pro-social bystanders. So you have the guy over here saying, I'm going to get with Callie, I'm going to get Callie so wasted that she can't say no. So we never show the perpetrator's face. These are college students, and we don't show their faces because we don't want to sort of have the student associated with sort of objectionable behavior. So he's saying he's going to get her so wasted she can't say no. So this is the opportunity for the bystanders to create a community norm where it's not acceptable. So the guy in the middle says, that's messed up. If you're going to do that, you have to leave now. And then the other bystander saying, if you want to get with the girl, that's not the way to do it. So we're teaching people bystander intervention skills, right? So we're role modeling behavior, and we're giving them information about the problem. So we've been able to actually, we have right now 22 images, and we put images on buses, on posters, on table tents, and we've been able to measure the effectiveness of these images, and we found that people exposed to the images have increased knowledge of the problems. They have increased knowledge of bystander intervention. They have greater willingness to intervene, and they have greater self-reported bystander behaviors. So here's, so this was a primary prevention. So this is stopping the problem before it happens. So here's one, this is the secondary prevention one. So this is about intimate partner violence, and again, the tagline here is intimate partner abuse is everyone's problem. Intervene when you see it and hear it. And this is really important because most of us have actually, you get trends from the media, that what happens behind closed doors, what stays behind closed doors. And I oftentimes think back to my own childhood. I grew up in a pretty densely urban area, and my parents always said to me, you know, what you hear happening next door is none of your business. I don't care what it is. And that really sort of stuck with me, and I know some of you may have had similar experiences. So we're encouraging people to recognize that even though this is kind of in a residence hall room, this has to do with you. So you've got the kind of the guy here who's physically restraining a woman, and she looks like she's you know, kind of trying to resist him. She's saying, "Let me go." And you have the two bystanders over here, and this one's saying, "We should stop him." Thank you. We should stop him. And the other bystander is saying, "Let's call the RA or the police." And what's really important here is that we're encouraging people to be safe. Okay? And so the best way to be safe as a bystander is to intervene with someone else. So they're sort of working together and at a distance. Okay? And so we don't want to encourage people to sort of get in the middle of a fight. Right? We want them to be safe because we certainly don't want them to be hurt. So that's one of our during scenes. So this is one actually that we developed with a lot of help from a few LGBT communities on our campus and a few other campuses. We had a group of individuals who identified as lesbian and queer who came to us and said, "We love the Know Your Power posters, but we don't see ourselves." And that's really important, an important lesson that we learned about developing these images is if the target audience doesn't see themselves, the effect of the intervention is really decreased. So the more students say, these people look like me, they talk like me, they're in situations that I'm familiar with, the higher the impact. So again, we've got a woman here who is the victim here. And her partner is here, and her partner is saying, "Get your shit now, we're leaving. I've had it with you flirting with her." And so the bystanders are right here. The first one is saying, "She's always talks to her like that. She's so controlling." The other bystander is saying, "We have to step in and say something. I don't care how awkward it is." And so, again, they're working together to try to figure out how to stop this behavior. Speak out against partner abuse. It affects people who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender. So here's one actually that we did at University of California, Merced, and again, this is where I think the social self-identification comes in play. We went to UC Merced and we did focus groups with like 300 students, and what we found out at UC Merced is that they party in garages. Do they party in garages here? So this is actually, this was filmed at UC Merced, and so they simulated a party in a garage. So you've got the one bystander saying, "Alex just took Emma to his room upstairs in the house." The middle bystander saying, "He got her wasted doing shots of beer pong." Then this bystander saying, "Let's make sure he doesn't do anything to her when she's drunk. That's rape." So again, it sort of is the knowledge piece about consent and alcohol. And the tagline is, "Friends, watch out for one another, especially when there's alcohol involved." So here's an after one. And again, we teach people how to be bystanders before, during, and after instances of sexual and relationship violence and stalking. And so it's got three sort of separate paintings, and the woman here is talking to a bystander and she's disclosing, "I said I didn't want to, he raped me." And so we hear from two other bystanders in these two next frames. The bystander here is saying, "It's not your fault, you didn't deserve this." And then the bystander up here, and again, it's really sort of breaking down the myths that we have about who can be a victim. The bystander here is saying, "He raped you. It happens to guys too. I believe you." So again, we're looking to dispel those myths. And the important tagline here is, "Support a friend. Your support encourages victims of violence to seek help." So I want to I'm going to talk a little bit more about what we learned in developing the images, and then I want to sort of open it up. But our target audience at the individual level. So we need to think about how do we get more people involved. And I wanted to give you some examples. And I know somebody gave the example of the bartender. So the Boston Area Rape Crisis Center has actually developed a bystander intervention prevention program for bartenders. It's called Bar Story. So you can Google that and find it. I don't know if your students go to bars, but look for ways to engage your local businesses, your bars or your clubs, and how they might be able to be pro-social bystanders. So the individuals in the center here, and then they're essentially surrounded by all of these systems: family, friends, health services, laws and policy. And so if we're looking to really change the culture and the community norms, if we only stay at the individual level, are we going to make systematic change? Yeah, so we need to sort of go beyond the individual level. Okay, so I want to do kind of lessons learned and tell you a little bit about the journey of developing the social marketing campaign. And then I want to hear how you think, again, this resonates with ATOD prevention. But so we started the Know Your Power campaign 10 years ago, and I claim absolutely to not be an artist or a graphic designer. Okay. So this is where we started, okay? And the target audience has been really just so important to developing the campaign. We have done focus groups and individual interviews and surveys with like thousands of students, and we have sort of met them where they are. Sometimes we go into fraternities, sororities, athletic teams, late at night, and we bring pizza and chocolate. That seems to be a good standard. But really important. So as far as the development of the campaign, the ideas for the images have always come from the target audience. And that's been really important because what my experience is on sort of going out on a Friday night as a 40-something-year-old is really different than what a 20-year-old or a 19-year-old or even a 32-year-old who's going back to school. So it is really, really different. So we have generated sort of mock-ups on what should they look like. We've recruited actors to serve in the posters or in the photos. We take hundreds of photos and we choose the photos. It's like this really long and involved process that involves us coming up with a draft and then going back to the target population. And so I don't know how many of you are actually involved in creating prevention materials that are images or get kind of hung up, or actually a fair number of you. So I don't know if this is a process that you use, not that you need to use our process, but I think what we really learned is that if the students, again, our target audience, which are students, don't see themselves, or if they got sort of caught up on a little detail, a whole other message is missed. Like we used to have a digital stalking image that had a flip phone in it. This is like 6 or 7 years ago. How many of you know what a flip phone is? Yeah, so most college students now do not know, and I just got rid of my flip phone about a year ago. But we were using the image of the flip phone, and we went to a university and did a focus group on it, and the students were just so like, what is that? And that's all they can focus on. So you need to make sure that, again, the target audiences, they see themselves. They see their Samsung Galaxy or their iPhone or whatever it is they use. So we do focus groups, we do revisions. And this is how we come up with the dialogue. And this is really, we came up with this again. A student said, I'd like to write the dialogue. So we come up, once we develop the images, we get, we print these on 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper. We white out the dialogue and we say to them, how would you say the kinds of things that you know belong here, right? We show them the original images and then we say, tell us how you would say it in your language. And we pretty much have said to the students, we will put everything except the F word on an image. And that makes a difference, right? Because when we started focus grouping them, we would put like asterisk, and they were like, no loser, like that's not how we do it. So basically we get the target audience to tell us what the language is. Now, I'm going to show you an image actually. So this is what that this is how we focus group. This is what the image looked like. This is on a bus. So I'm going to read it to you, and then I'm going to show you the California one, and you can tell me what the difference is. Okay, so I'm sorry, I don't know how much you can read this, but the guy on the left is saying, my friend Jeff is the man. He got this girl passed out drunk and then nailed her. So the guy in the middle says, you gotta be kidding, your friend raped her. And this guy says, your friend's pathetic. Again, just speak up when you hear stories that glorify sexual violence. Your response can make a difference. So we focus grouped this at the University of California, Merced. And we then went to California, Merced and came up with the images. We took the photos. So here's this. Is there anybody from Merced here? Okay. Okay, so here's what again, they use some of our language, but so this is what the Merced students came up with. My friend Jeff is the man. He banged this passed out chick at the party last night. Guy in the middle says, dude, that's great. This guy says, that's so not cool. What's wrong with you? Your friend's messed up. So what are some key words that are in the UC Merced one that are not in the University of New Hampshire one? Dude. Nobody says dude where I am. They say Mickey, right? And probably Mickey has a totally different connotation here than it does there.
He says, what's wrong with you? Your friend's messed up. It focuses on the facilitator rather than the rapist.
Yes. Yeah, that's another important point. Yep. Yeah. Yep. And yep. Definitely. Passed out chick. Right. So we have realized again that we need to shift these things to make sure that it resonates with the target audience. So other things that we learned, and again I won't go through all of these, but we essentially learned that when we developed these images, we went to an off-campus designer. Now, I'm not going to assume anything about your graphic designers, but what our students said is that please don't go to UNH printing services to have them design this, because they design sort of like the standard flyer brochure, and it looks exactly like every other one. So we went in search of youth cool designers, right? So we ended up in like an old factory building in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, where there was all these exposed beams, and we sat down, and every time we went there, like, hey, you want a Red Bull? It's like, because Red Bull was one of their top customers, as well as a snowboard magazine. So we went to a graphic designer who sort of developed the images in what we say youth cool. The bad thing about that, and we learned this, again, not knowing anything about graphic design, was that they owned the images, right? So it was like a near legal battle. So we got the images, and now we have hired sort of like an in-house person to design the images or to continue to adapt the images. We've adapted it on other campuses. What's really important about the implementation of the campaign, and this is, again, we learned this through trial and error, is that we have a time-limited rollout of the campaign. So essentially what we do is we do it between 4 and 6 weeks. We very visibly saturate the campus. That means that every computer that's owned by the university has a pop-up screen. No matter whoever gets on that computer, the pop-up screen pops up an image, and you need to X out of it to get out of it. We put the images on buses, posters, table tents, bookmarks, digital screens. We usually only run 4 images at a time. And after the campaign, we take it all down. So we very visibly put it there, and we very visibly take it away. Any thoughts on why we do that? To make it noticeable, because guess how many images college students see in a day? Like thousands, right? Thousands. So we need to sort of stand out. What we found is that collaboration is key, right? So we had to let the president of the university know that there were buses circulating throughout our campus as well as our communities that had alcohol bottles on them. Right? That was a little actually controversial. We weren't sure if he would go for it. He was fine with it. Excuse me. What he had a problem with was the street harassment scene where the guy was hanging out of the window saying, "Hey baby, nice ass," right? And we actually got some call, a bus driver quit over having the word ass on a bus. And we had a local middle school guidance counselor really call the president and march into the president's office to say how irresponsible we were to put the word ass on a bus. And our response was, we would love to come and do media education and literacy with the teachers at your middle school and the kids at your middle school, because if you're worried about the word ass, guess what? That is like nothing compared to what they're seeing, right? So we had to build, and we went to that middle school and we did that, right? So we're building the capacity of everyone around us. We have done, I actually am a researcher by training that works a lot with practitioners, so evaluation is really important. You need to measure the success of what you're doing. And we do that, and we did that through a formative process, meaning we did it as we were developing it, and then as an outcome. And so we did for the outcome evaluation, pre and post tests, and then sort of a follow-up. We gave incentives. We give incentives for people to participate. We used to give B's when we started, right? B's are not at all cool now. They want money, right? They just want the cold hard cash. So we give them cash. And, now, e-surveys are the big thing, so you need to be conscious of what other kinds of traffic is there. Essentially what we found is that social marketing campaigns do change attitudes as well as behaviors. We know that dose matters, so that the more the target audience is exposed to the image, the higher the effect, and that's why we literally saturate campus everywhere. So I think I have like 5 minutes left, is that right? So I want to stop there because I would love to hear sort of your thoughts, reactions, how you see bystander intervention and what we've done with bystander intervention with sexual and relationship violence and stalking, perhaps overlap with ATOD or... Yeah.
Actually, I have a question. What is your advice? You gave an example of in the bathroom scene where that girl was being harmed by that guy, and they decided that they were going to call the police or the RA. What is your advice if you feel, or the bystander feels like they don't have enough time to wait for the police to come to effectively deal with the situation? Like, what should a bystander do to intervene in a safe way?
Yeah. So, and we oftentimes. We do a lot of trainings and we ask students that question. So I'm going to give you a frame of how you might respond, and I'm going to ask not only students, but I'm going to ask folks to come up with some ideas. So one of the ways that you can be a bystander is causing a distraction. You don't necessarily need to be sort of like Captain Bystander, as I say. It's like, I'm here to save the day, right? I mean, ultimately, that'd be great, but it's not practical, and some people just don't want to do that. So think of a distraction. Think of a distraction that these students could have done to maybe intervene here. Any examples? Yeah.
Knocking the door and saying, "You're going on the box." Normally, it's
Okay. So if you wanted to knock on the door and not say you were calling the cops, what would you knock on the door and say?
Hey, come in here.
Yeah, come out and see this. Hey, did you guys order a pizza? Right? What are some other ways to distract?
Talk really loudly outside the door.
Yeah, hey, I have a question for you now here. So a distraction is a great way to think about how to, again, just cause enough of a blip to get him away from her. And then you could sort of like, one of these bystanders could say, and maybe if the woman knows this woman, let's say her name is Sarah. Hey Sarah, can you come here for a second? I have a question for you. This guy can go to the RA. So that would be a good way for them to sort of work together. Students come up with the craziest, funniest distractions. Like, I'll give you some examples and maybe you can build upon them. At a party scene, they see like even if it's like one of their women friends kind of like broke
Definitely, thank you.
Yeah. Other thoughts or questions? Yeah.
What do you have, what advice do you have for a student who's interested in social marketing?
Social marketing. I would get together with somebody else who's involved and interested in social marketing. I mean, I think that social marketing can be so very powerful. And so I think getting together with other students who are interested or sort of going to the office on campus that does health education or wellness. And there are so many ways to do social marketing. I mean, we do, again, the traditional posters, table tents, etc. But start a YouTube channel. There's lots of ways to do it. So I think kind of finding other people who are interested, taking a look at what's out there, what do you think are ways that you could develop an image, or where would you put an image so that it would be creative. Like really, and we partnered once with our ATOD folks on our campus, and we partnered with bars that we came up with bystander intervention posters. Right, at bars and napkins. And I don't know from the ATOD world whether or not you sort of do that, but think about what are ways to brand the message that you're trying to get out there. Think about getting it out in really creative, non-traditional ways, right? And make sure that if you're a student doing this, that you're asking other students, like, what would you pay attention to? What's too much? What would be flashy enough for you to pay attention to, especially because your students are overrun with images, so you need to sort of come up with that kind of angle. And I think another really important thing is that, oftentimes, at least in the sexual assault and prevention field, it's like, we sometimes think, well, the typical students, those who are really, they just came from a women's studies class, or they're feminists, are the ones involved. But in social marketing, this is a great example of go to your business students and say, you're going to be in marketing. Help us market this message. So it's a great way to sort of reach across aisles and get people to contribute to something that they have a lot of expertise on, and they normally wouldn't think that this had anything to do with them. But it really, bystander intervention is everybody has a role to play. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
How do you deal with the backlash? Like, for example, you talk about middle school, how they how are other ways that you can make sure that you are being able to stay true to the message about opinion?
Well, and I think that the way that we do that is to make sure that as many voices are around the table in planning. We probably should, before the buses went out, we probably should have really thought about where will the buses be off our community, off our campus. So I think really being as inclusive as possible and getting people on board before the middle school guidance counselor marches into the president's office. So getting people involved early on. I think one of